Wow. You've given us some really intense material to work with this time
Look,
around.
this is heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is. And we're going to be talking about what you've identified as Bruce's breaking point in December of 2019.
Right? A really pivotal moment in his journey. I
Yeah,
mean, really.
absolutely. And we're going to be drawing from chapter 24 and sort of the overarching themes of his journey.
Exactly. And all the stuff that you've helpfully laid out for us in the guide to previous discussions, so we can really ground this moment in the context of everything that's come before.
Right. And so I think it's important to state right off the bat that this wasn't, as chapter 24 makes very clear, that this wasn't like a sudden thing. This was like the culmination of years of trauma and injustice.
Right. 15 years, 15 years, a decade and a half of the stuff building up.
Yeah, and we're gonna really try to unpack what the specific trigger was that pushed Bruce to this point and the internal state that he was experiencing.
Yeah. Turning to chapter 24, one of the things that really jumped out at me right away was this constant presence of the lie. How it just never went away for him.
Yeah, and this is something that he talks about, almost this habitual act of Googling his own name. It's almost like he's compelled to do it. Like maybe there's a sliver of hope that things have changed, but time and again, that narrative is right there in the search results. And I think it's difficult to fully grasp the cumulative psychological burden of that, like that constant digital reminder. What kind of impact do you think that has on someone who's trying to heal and move forward from trauma?
It speaks to, I think, a really unique challenge of our digital age. This idea that there's this narrative about you out there that's just constantly accessible to everyone and feels so beyond your control.
And then as idea.
Completely inescapable.
Yes, and especially when you think about the specific instance that he recounts about John F. reposting the article on his website that misidentified the perpetrator as a girl. That detail, I think, is so significant because he explicitly states she wasn't a girl, she was the perpetrator, I was the one who bled, right? And yet this fundamental piece of misinformation is being amplified and spread even further, and it's mind-blowing, the disregard for the truth there.
It's incredibly frustrating to read. I mean, how does that kind of blatant misrepresentation compound the trauma that he's already experiencing?
Yeah, I think it adds this whole other layer of powerlessness, right? Like you're constantly seeing this version of events that is just not true and being presented as fact, and it just undermines any sense of agency in reclaiming your own narrative.
Absolutely. And if we kind of zoom out a little bit and look at this in the context of the bigger picture of his journey, I mean, this online presence of this lie is really directly attacking his efforts to rebuild his identity as a survivor.
Right.
He's being confronted with this version of himself that is not who he is.
Right. And it wasn't as if he was being passive about this, right? Like the chapter details his years of therapy,
Yeah.
the difficult work of trauma processing, his repeated attempts to share his true story with others. Like he was actively engaged in trying to heal and seek some semblance of justice for what had happened.
Exactly. He wasn't just sitting back and taking this, he was actively trying to find a path forward and to heal from this incredibly deep wound that had been inflicted on him.
Right. And yet, as he so poignantly observes, the words disappeared into a society that didn't care.
Yeah. What do you think contributes to that kind of societal indifference towards this individual suffering?
I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I think maybe it's a form of emotional self-preservation, this reluctance to engage with painful realities, or maybe it speaks to a broader societal issue where certain narratives are prioritized over others.
Yeah. And there's also this powerful mantra that he repeats throughout the chapter, this idea that I couldn't live in a world where people thought I had harmed a woman, which I think is such a clear articulation of his core moral conflict.
Such a strong statement.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It reveals this deep internal integrity that he has, and how profoundly disturbing it was to him to be perceived as someone who would harm a woman. But as he comes to realize later, Dupley felt personal convictions, while important, don't automatically alter external realities.
Right.
And in his case, this moral stance, while central to who he was, offered no solution to the very real problem that he was facing.
Right, and this brings us to what seems like the breaking point before the breaking point, which is his final attempt to seek some form of legal recourse. And he talks about reaching out to this prepaid legal law firm and feeling like this was the only accessible option left to him. What stood out to you about this particular attempt?
I think this moment is really revealing of his persistent hope that there's going to be some kind of systemic intervention on his behalf.
Right.
Like he lays out his case once again. He tries to explain the nuances of the situation, the complexities of the plea deal, the ongoing damage caused by the misreported news article on John F.'s website. And despite years of being disappointed and let down, he's still holding on to this idea that the legal system might actually offer him some kind of validation or redress.
Right. And the response is so stark and so final. There's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
And delivered in this very like casual, dismissive manner.
Right. Just flippantly.
Yeah, and the fact that they seem to accept the news article as true simply because of his initial arrest and charges, completely overlooking the factual inaccuracies that he presented, it just must have felt like the ultimate betrayal.
The final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, by a system that had already failed him so profoundly. What kind of psychological impact do you think that has on a person, that complete sense of being abandoned by the very systems that are meant to protect you?
I mean, it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. I think it reinforces that sense of helplessness and hopelessness, that there's no one coming to help you,
Right.
that you're on your own, that the injustice that you've experienced is insurmountable, and it just cements those really profound questions that he articulates in this chapter. What do you do when the lie wins, when justice is unavailable, when the past isn't just haunting you, it's stalking you, shaping your future, dictating your limits?
And it's after this crushing rejection that he describes a significant shift in his internal state. And it's not a surge of panic or anger or anything like that. It's this quiet sense of resignation. What's the significance of that shift from this outward struggle to this inner quiet?
I think that quietness can often be a very concerning sign of despair.
Yeah.
It suggests a point at which the individual has exhausted all perceived avenues of action, and the internal struggle has just become too overwhelming to actively fight anymore.
Right.
And I think that can be a very dangerous place to be. It can be a precursor to withdrawing from the world entirely.
Right. And,
Yeah.
and he mentions the vodka, and it's not portrayed as this, descent into oblivion or anything like that. It's presented as this very calculated attempt to find the courage to take the actions that he felt were necessary.
Right. He's using it to self-medicate in a way,
Yeah.
to overcome this internal barrier that he's experiencing.
That's a chilling detail.
It is. And then there's the detail about the effects, or his antidepressant medication, almost like a quiet testament to his ongoing efforts to manage his mental health and prevent a crisis like this from happening.
And yet here we are.
And yet here we are.
And it wasn't, in his words, some dramatic gesture. It was a direct and logical consequence of that law firm's response and the relentless reemergence of this lie, and the detail about John F.'s continued influence even after death through that reposted article misrepresenting a grown woman as a girl. It just really underscores the inescapable nature of this false narrative.
It really is inescapable for him. And that persistent misrepresentation, I think, is especially insidious because it not only perpetuates the core falsehood, but it also manipulates.
Yeah. And he describes being disoriented. His thoughts are clouded, but not entirely gone. And in that critical moment, despite everything he's been through, he still articulates his hurt and his profound sense of hopelessness.
Right. There's still a part of him that wants to be heard and understood.
Yeah, and his immediate resistance to the patrol car, that visceral reaction to the prospect of handcuffs is such a potent reminder of the deep trauma that he's experienced at the hands of the system.
Absolutely. His past interactions have clearly left these lasting scars.
Yeah, and the fact that the officers on the scene agreed to call an ambulance instead, acknowledging that past trauma, it represents a rare moment of understanding within a system that has so often failed him.
It does.
And then the scene shifts to the sterile environment of the emergency room. December 11, 2019, he's no longer crying. There's this sense of finality, of surrender. What does that lack of emotional expression signify at that point?
I think often that absence of tears, that sense of surrender, can indicate a really profound level of emotional and mental exhaustion. Like the struggle has ceased and it's been replaced by this feeling of inevitability.
Right, and he has this internal recognition that he's crossed a line.
Right.
And even though he questions the severity of his actions in that moment,
Mhm.
noting that he didn't take all the pills, he didn't lose consciousness, he recognizes that something fundamental within him had shifted.
Absolutely.
And then the transfer to another floor, and the almost surreal experience of being on the other side of the assessment process, having previously been the one conducting similar evaluations. What kind of psychological dissonance do you think that created for him?
I imagine that must have been such a jarring and disorienting experience for him.
Right.
A stark and personal reflection of how dramatically his circumstances had changed.
And his attempt to downplay the situation to the psych resident, perhaps drawing on his own professional understanding of these types of evaluations, it seems like an attempt to regain some sense of control in a situation where he felt utterly powerless.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very human thing to do, to try to manage the narrative, even in the midst of this crisis.
Right. But the resident, despite his attempts to minimize things, stands firm and makes the decision for admission. And as we've discussed, this event, this breaking point in December of 2019 represents a really significant turning point in Bruce's ongoing journey of trauma and healing. It's the moment where the cumulative weight of everything he's endured finally reaches a critical mass. And as we've seen foreshadowed in the developing theme guide, this is really just the beginning.
Yeah, and if we reflect on the core themes that have emerged throughout his story, I mean, this moment is such a stark and painful illustration of the devastating impact of toxic shame.
Right.
This deep-seated feeling of worthlessness that could be so insidious.
And specifically, I think this breaking point really underscores that feeling of being fundamentally unworthy. His truth has been repeatedly denied and dismissed, and in that moment, it must have felt as though the lie had and completely triumphed.
Exactly, and it compels us to grapple with this really fundamental question. What does it truly take for an individual to reach such a point of despair?
Right.
Considering the cumulative and corrosive effects of unrelenting trauma and injustice, what are the broader implications for how our society understands and responds to these really deeply entrenched issues?
Those are really important questions.
They are.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into this incredibly difficult but crucial chapter of Bruce's journey.